You can't win if you set boundaries because you're going to feel guilty for setting that limit, though it's the only healthy thing to do. You can't win if you stay silent. You feel guilty for creating tension in the relationship. You can't win if you think a bad thought about them. You feel guilty for being a rotten person who thinks bad thoughts. Everywhere you turn, it's guilt, guilt, guilt. So let's talk about confusion. I don't understand this. I do not understand what's happening to me, says everyone in a narcissistic relationship. That idea of simply not understanding what's happening to you, the most classical quote of a narcissistic relationship, is universal. Confusion tops the list of what happens to anybody who's in a narcissistic relationship. The toxic stew of gaslighting mixed up with idealization, devaluing, discarding, invalidation, dismissiveness, their ability to put on a great show in public but then treat you terribly in private, their ability to be really successful on paper, in school, in business, but to then lie, cheat, and trick people. Everyone thinks you're so lucky you met someone so great, and you are so flooded with shame and confusion for what a mess this relationship is that you don't know what's right anymore. They're nice on one day, they're mean on another. It doesn't make sense. Confusion is one of the leading kinds of states we observe in children who grow up in narcissistic families, and even when they are adults and still dealing with a narcissistic parent, confusion is one of the leading emotions. People from these families will say, well, my parents fed me, and then they insult me. Sometimes they were proud of me, then they're angry at me. I told them that I'm sad. They told me I shouldn't be sad. It's confusing. Confusing is an awful state to live in because it starts to bleed into other areas of your life. It's a precursor in many ways to something else that we have discussed elsewhere in this series on narcissistic abuse, namely second guessing and self-doubt. When you are confused, you no longer trust your judgment. And so obviously making decisions becomes really difficult. And you start to no longer trust yourself or even your own feelings. Confusion is also something that precedes what I term self-gaslighting. When you say things to yourself like, well, maybe I have no right to feel that way, or I think I might be making too big a deal out of this, or it's not that really, this relationship isn't really that bad. I should stop asking for so much. Once a person gets to the self-gaslighting stage, narcissistic abuse is pretty severe at that point. And it takes a fair amount of work to get a person out of that loop of thinking in that self-gaslighting way and to teach them to trust themselves again, especially if it's going on all their lives. Narcissists love confusion. In fact, when they finally get you to a state of confusion, in their minds, they've won. Narcissists sow seeds of confusion through multiple pathways. Some I've already mentioned, such as gaslighting and invalidation. But they also foster confusion through future faking. He said he would change. She said we would move when she was done with school. My mother promised that she would help with some of these financial issues after I helped her. You find yourself poring over old text messages and old emails, making sure you heard them right. And then you get confused. Well, maybe I didn't. Maybe I didn't read that right. Their lying is also a contributor to the confusion. When someone is deliberately withholding the truth, you will be confused. Their sort of Jekyll, Hyde, two-faced, double life approach. One face for public, one face for you. Some days that are good, some days that are awful. Many people say, I could stay in this relationship forever. I'd want to spend time with my parents forever if it was just the good or even the above average days. It's not. You got to adjust to the bad days. Those are the ones, sadly, that matter. Narcissists also use triangulation to create confusion, pitting people against each other, spreading gossip and secrets and smear campaigns. You will become confused because you believed you had a support network and friends who now seem to be looking at you differently. Or there's a tremendous sense of mistrust which pervades your family or your place of employment. The challenge with confusion, and again, classical part of narcissistic abuse, the challenge with confusion is that it pulls you off of your A game. A confused person is an inefficient person. As a result, you are always trying to figure out where you are, who you are. The best analogy I can give is if you have gone on a trip and wake up someplace new, like a hotel room or a guest room, and you're tired from traveling. You wake up in the middle of the night or in the morning, and you just aren't sure where you are. Have you ever had that happen? You're like, wait a minute, where am I? Where am I? Your heart races a little. You're a little bit disoriented. You almost need to talk out loud to yourself. Interestingly, this literally happened to me last night, so it's very fresh for me. And I literally had to say, like, it's okay. You're in your bed. You're in your house. You just got here. It's very early in the morning. See, the sun's coming out. I was literally saying this out loud. You may even pick up your phone or look out a window to orient yourself. That's how confusing that can be. Now, that feeling of confusion, waking up confused, that's every day for a person who's experiencing narcissistic abuse. Because narcissists thrive when you are confused, they want to keep you confused. And don't confront them on it because they will deny it and call you crazy for believing they want you confused. You know the whole drill by now. Just please trust me when I tell you that you being confused is actually an easier place for them because it does allow for maintaining that more dominant position. So what do? First, take a page out of that analogy I just gave you, the I just woke up confused playbook, and sometimes talk out loud to yourself. Even take a minute and touch your face, touch your arms, just to orient yourself. I'm Ramani. I'm here. It's Thursday. Simple as that sounds, you just need to pop out of the confusion, and sometimes just touching, speaking out loud can do that. Secondly, and this next point is this is guidance I have given at other times for other elements of narcissistic abuse, and it matters here a lot. You should be keeping a running record, hard as it may be, of the problematic things that happen in your narcissistic relationship. The gaslighting, the lies, the two-facedness, the future faking, whatever it is. And then, when you are feeling confused, look at this. Look at it. There's nothing confusing at all. If the record is showing that this person actually treats you really badly, you have it right there. And so the good days, don't erase the slate. Consistency is important. Now, while none of us are perfect in our relationship, if someone is consistently gaslighting you, that's never acceptable. Let them shove their good days. Their good days become a weapon. Remember that. Don't overgeneralize from the good days. You also have to remember the bad ones. I know that is such negativistic guidance, but sometimes it can help you with the confusion where you might see things as all black and all white. It's gray, but it's gray that's very uncomfortable. Number 3 is you need to find a private place, a very trusted friend or therapy, and say it out loud. Just say it out loud. My father is a liar. My husband is a cheater and a gaslighter. My friend she's not a kind person. My boss is a manipulative triangulator who would throw any of us under the bus. Say it out loud. Somehow, when we say something out loud to a witness, it can jar us out of our rationalizations and justifications and our confusion. It's like a reboot, seeing something in harsh light and giving name to it. If you can't find a trusted person, do it into the mirror and say it out loud. Fourth, don't call the narcissist out. I know I've said this on other videos, but just don't do it. It simply leaves you feeling more confused. When you spend time showing them texts and printing out emails and showing them their social media posts and playing them videos, catching them in their lies and gaslighting, they just double down and confuse you more. You have the evidence. Don't let the narcissist be the judge and jury on themselves. Unconfuse yourself by drinking in the reality of the text or the email or the recording. Stop using them as the reality check. I know you want to show them, but they remain invested in you being confused. So don't waste that time. Fifth, please find your people. People who you trust and people who trust you. People who will not confuse you. People who will never gaslight your reality. These need to be your people. And be that person for someone else. When you love someone, believe them the first time. Bear witness to their pain. And in an ideal relationship, whether it's a friendship or a family relationship, anyone, they can bear witness to yours. These kinds of healing relationships can also ease you out of the confusion of narcissistic abuse. The confusion element of narcissistic abuse is why the overall syndrome of narcissistic abuse has been in the shadows for so long. Because we have become such a world of enablers for the narcissists, even a lot of mental health professionals don't call it out. Again, leaving you even more confused. In some ways, we are becoming a nation and a world of very confused people because we are becoming a world of narcissists and their enablers. Please hold on to your reality. You know what's right for you. You know what's wrong for you. You know what's, most importantly, you know what's safe for you. Own that, please, and please learn to break through this confusion. Because shame is such an important dynamic in people who are experiencing narcissistic abuse. When people come from narcissistic family systems, first of all, it can take years to even identify that's what it was. When you're a child, you kind of only know what you know, right? So if you have one or more narcissistic parents or other significant family members or even siblings, at some level, your family of origin becomes your normal. As you go on and get older, and particularly as you enter sort of middle school and then into adolescence, you start seeing that there's more than one way to be a family, and you start getting templates for healthier families. Some kids may even notice this by watching television, watching movies, saying, this is not how all families are. But it is amazing what rationalizing storytellers children can be to make their own families seem normal. But every single one of you who came from a narcissistic family knew from a very early age something wasn't quite right. But how many 4-year-old kids know what the hell narcissism is, right? You didn't know. So you did your best. And then you became an adult. And then you went into the world. And people talked about their families. A theme that I've heard from many clients, many people I've worked with, clients I've worked with, just people I've talked to over the years, is a sense of shame that they experience when they realize how damaged their family system was. I can think of a few stories off the top of my head when people say, I met a new partner, or I had a new roommate or a friend, and they were talking about their parents, and their parents had a really happy marriage, and they go on trips together, and they have these really happy holidays. And the person who came from that narcissistic family system or that damaged family system would often tell me, I felt such an overwhelming sense of shame. I felt a sense of being less than. And they found themselves withdrawing at that point. And what happened, sadly, is it would reinforce this narrative they held within themselves that somehow they were less than because other people didn't come from these kinds of dysfunctional narcissistic family systems. That sense of shame, to me, in some ways, is like a cancer inside of a person that erodes them away and blocks them from seeing their goodness, their value, and the fact that we all have stuff. But when we compare ourselves to others, which we so often do, and especially when it comes to something as primitive as a family of origin, it can really be unsettling for us. When we become adults, especially people who have maybe distanced themselves a little from their family of origin, maybe they don't even think about it every day. But then they'll have that kind of a conversation, and it'll hit them like a ton of bricks. It's an interesting issue because when it comes up over and over again for people, they handle it in different ways. The most off-sided example I hear is that people will say, I just became quiet when the conversation went that way. I sort of tried to sugarcoat what my family really was like. And they almost felt too exposed and too vulnerable if they were really honest and said, my family of origin was a mess. It was cruel. It was invalidating. It was abusive. It was negating. People don't like to talk about that. Now keep in mind, I'm a shrink. So people come into my office, they're paying me, of course they're going to tell me about their really difficult family stories, but it's not that that's what they open up with. It takes us a minute to get there. I'm amazed at how many people I have talked to over the years who initially are very, very protective of the image of their family. And over weeks, months, and years, as we dig deeper, the story unfolds itself like the layers of an onion coming off. And that the story they were portraying of what felt like a normal and intact family turns out to be one that's very dysfunctional, very invalidating, and very unkind. But the challenge with that sense of shame is what it does to us, not just in that one conversation, but in all areas of our lives, with one of the greatest manifestations of we feel less than. Keep in mind, too, shame is one of those emotions that almost always drives people to behave badly. And that behaving badly can be one of two paths. You can behave badly internally, where you socially withdraw, you engage in negative self-talk, you talk about yourself badly, you don't allow yourself to fully pursue the things you're interested in because you think so little of yourself, you feel like you're not enough. Or you may even attempt to numb yourself. In the most extreme levels, that might even include things like self-harm. Shame can also lead people to what we call more externalizing behaviors. They may act out. They may become angry and rude to other people. They may engage in risky behaviors, risky sexual behaviors, other dangerous behaviors. Here's where it gets interesting. We're talking about how a narcissistic family of origin can leave a person feeling shame as an adult. Shame is also a big part of narcissism. So it's almost like this is where it all folds in on itself. And in fact, one of the arguments for why narcissists behave as badly as they do is that they often do walk around with a feeling of shame because they behave badly so often. At some level, they know they're behaving badly. They feel ashamed. And guess what they do then? They behave badly again. For the rest of us, it tends to be more of a slow shaving off of our sense of who we are, and not being able to be vulnerable with it. Why? Because if we're vulnerable with that shameful sense of who we are, we're going to be rejected. So now let's take this a step further. Like I said, it is very common for people who come from narcissistic family systems to feel shame. And you may not even call it a narcissistic family system, call it a dysfunctional family system. Now, you may be choosing a partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, fiance, husband, wife, whatever. Being from a narcissistic family system can sometimes make it a little bit more risky that you will choose a partner even if they're not full-on narcissistic, who's invalidating, who's devaluing, who criticizes you, who puts you down, who doesn't see your full sense of worth and goodness. Many times, again, it's that shame dynamic playing out. That early shame you carry into a relationship choice, and the shame plays out again. It's like the shame begets more shame. That dynamic of feeling ashamed for being from a narcissistic family plays itself out again for people who are in narcissistic relationships. People who may have a narcissistic partner, husband, wife, spouse, partner, whatever, often feel very ashamed, especially when the relationship goes south, and especially if the relationship ends. They feel ashamed because they're in an unhealthy relationship. They feel ashamed because other people seem to be in healthy relationships. They feel ashamed because other people's partners aren't always talking to them in a disrespectful way. They feel ashamed because their partner's cheating on them. They feel ashamed because someone else is cheating on them. They feel ashamed because the relationship didn't work. All of those things combine then to a person doing what many people who are ashamed do, to isolating, to not getting help. I can't tell you over my career how many people have come into my office. One of the first things they say in the first 10 minutes that they're a little bit embarrassed and ashamed to be sharing the story. There are no shameful stories. You share them, and once those stories come out into the light, in many ways that's when you master them. This is where you see, for example, in Brené Brown's work, that power of vulnerability. It really allows you to eradicate and address that sense of shame, because vulnerability is in fact the most beautiful part of yourself. It's what makes you human, it's what makes you poetic. But when you come from a narcissistic family system, you're taught that your vulnerability made you weak, that your emotions made you a target of abuse. Your vulnerability put you at risk. Why the hell would you play? If you knew that your vulnerability put you at risk, why the hell would you lead with that as an adult? That cycle of shame through a life that comes from your family of origin, that you may be carrying quietly as an adult, and that you may carry into other relationships, is a critical focus, an issue that many people who've been through any form of narcissistic relationship experience. Another example of where we might see this is, let's say a person who works in a toxic workplace environment is harassed, demeaned, diminished, demoted, or maybe even fired. I'm amazed at how many people who've endured harassment of some form in the workplace actually feel ashamed. They weren't the perpetrator. This was something that was done to them. But it highlights again that dynamic of being in those relationships and how they often trigger and activate that shame dynamic. One of the key pieces of work I try to do with clients who are experiencing narcissistic abuse is cut to the core of that shame. Because that shame is something within themselves that's imprisoning them. And so often it comes from that font, that's legacy issues of the narcissistic family, of feeling that you came from a damaged place. You may very well have come from a dysfunctional family. That doesn't make you damaged. That is simply a part of your story. But if you carry that identity, that you are somehow shameful or damaged, the choices you make in your life are going to be in line with that identity. Your narcissistic family has already harmed you enough. Don't let them keep harming you by holding on to the identities they put on you of you being less than, because they didn't have their psychological houses in order. Please pay attention to this dynamic. For me, it's one of the most devastating things I've seen when I've worked with survivors of narcissistic abuse. The amount of shame they feel about the families they come from, about the relationships they're in now, about the choices they've made in their life. That cycle has to end somewhere. And for many of you, I hope you start working on it today. Guilt is the emotion we feel when we believe we have done something wrong. For people, most people who have normally wired nervous systems, guilt is uncomfortable, And it's uncomfortable enough that it's an incentive to not do something bad, so we don't need to feel guilty, because people don't like to feel guilty. In fact, that feeling is so icky, we're like, oh, I'm going to do the bad thing, so I don't need to feel guilty. And yet, many people, especially people going through narcissistic abuse, will feel guilty when they ostensibly have actually literally done nothing wrong. Guilt is a very common part, like I said, a very common part of the pattern we witness in people experiencing narcissistic abuse. People experiencing narcissistic abuse are constantly walking around thinking and feeling bad, honestly, for something that they believe that they've done wrong. So let's just start with some basics on what guilt is about. I'm going to give you several examples that you should be able to identify with to help understand guilt. You go to the store. You put things in your cart. They check you out. You leave the store. You drive home. And when you get home, you realize that there's something you didn't pay for because it was in that bottom part of your cart. So you feel guilty because it costs, I don't know, more than $20 or something. You may even call the store. You might even go through the trouble of going back to the store because you feel like, I shouldn't take this thing. You're attracted to a coworker and you're just friends and you already are in your own close relationship. And you're spending a lot of time talking to the coworker, and you're attracted to them, and you agree to meet this person at a park near a place where you traditionally and regularly run your errands. You leave the house. You tell your partner that you're going out to run errands at your usual places, a grocery store and all of that. And you do go to the grocery store, but then you go to the park and you meet the coworker and you feel guilty for lying to your partner because, yeah, you did go to the grocery store, but a little bit of a sin of omission, right? And you did something that if your partner found out, it would hurt them. Another example, you're a student and a classmate shares the answers to a quiz because you're in the same class but at different times, and they share the answers to a quiz that they took an hour earlier and you're going to take in a little while. And you copy the answers and you feel guilty. In all of these examples, there was at some level of big and small levels, violation of social and ethical codes. People probably feel bad if those things happen, and maybe they won't do them again. Maybe they'll apologize. Maybe they'll try to fix it. Now, for those folks out there with more of a psychopathic streak or narcissistic streak, you might not feel anything, or you might feel entitled. Some people might feel like, I feel bad, but that store is an hour away. I'm not going to drive back, whatever it is. But at least there was that feeling like that wasn't cool. I should have just walked off with that thing in my cart or stolen the quiz answers. But now let's talk about another set of examples of guilt. What about in a situation you have a narcissistic mom and she expects you to call her every single day? Let's say your mom is perfectly healthy, she's got a good life, but she still walks around feeling that nobody likes her and that you're her child, so you owe her a call. You hate the calls. The calls are largely your mom being a victim and complaining about other people in the family and being angry. She never asks about you. But if you were to miss one of those calls, she'll get really angry. It's like you make these calls just to be sort of a punching bag. You finally set a boundary and say, you know what, Mom, I can't call you every day. I am really busy. I have a full-time job. I got kids. I got other stuff to deal with. I'd be happy that if we set a time, I'll call you once per week. Would you feel guilty in that situation? Because if you would feel guilty, because a lot of people would, what did the person do wrong there? They let her down? They didn't enable her? They set a boundary? Are those bad things to feel guilty for? Here's another example. You have a narcissistic sibling who gets away with everything. They're the golden child in the family. This sibling sucks all the oxygen out of any family event, but they expect that any event that's about them or involves them, like their own birthday or their own anniversary or their wedding, goes off without a hitch. Your sibling is going to host a holiday get-together of some kind. And they want everything to start on time and things to happen in a certain way, and they want everyone to look perfect for pictures. But this is, of course, the person who ruins everyone else's events. You watch the clock, you're busy at work, you really want to go, you have to get some stuff resolved, but finally you do drag yourself to go. And because of all the things you need to do, you're late. And this enrages your sibling. You feel guilty for running late to this holiday get-together, knowing how important time was. You know inside that you could have probably gotten things done in a way and that you were running late because you actually are disgusted by the fact that this sibling always gets their way, that the family system runs around to make this one sibling's life run seamlessly, but the sibling has no insight into the pain and the harm they've done to others because everyone is afraid of them, so it does everything according to their rules. So you, in a tiny little way, you were late because you just wanted a little of the gratification of that control. You didn't want the sibling to control you. You didn't want them to always get their way. But you felt guilty for being late. What'd you do wrong? Would you feel bad? Did you feel like you did something wrong there? Was showing up late wrong? It's just a holiday party. Was having the feelings about not wanting your sibling to have everything go perfect for them, was that wrong? Does it need to result in guilt? Another example for you to chew on. You have a spouse or partner who is invalidating, manipulative, and just a general gaslighting nightmare. You are not leaving the marriage because you have children and you don't want to do the whole joint custody, split the assets thing. But internally, you get a little bit of glee, a little bit of that schadenfreude when things go badly for him because you're so angry. You think of the day, you look forward to the day that someone's going to call this spouse of yours out for the terrible things that this person has done to other people. And then you feel guilty for having these bad thoughts. What did you do wrong to feel guilty for? Think bad thoughts? Does that qualify for guilt? Many survivors of narcissistic abuse either feel guilty for having feelings or because they feel like they violated certain sorts of social, societal expectations that they were given. I feel guilty that I didn't get married. It's all my parents ever wanted for me, but I just didn't meet the right person. I love my work. I feel guilty that I didn't take over my family business. I can't stand the work. It is no interest of mine. My dad worked his whole life at it, and I couldn't stand working with him. He's very abusive. I feel guilty that I didn't go to my spouse's softball game. He loves all the attention it gets him, but it's actually kind of embarrassing for me. I feel guilty that I didn't give my adult child my old car, despite the fact that he verbally abuses me. I feel guilty about pretending to be sick so I don't have to go to my in-laws' Sunday dinner because they are so rude to me. The survivor of narcissistic abuse often feels guilt for things like not liking the narcissist in their lives, for feeling that they're not doing enough to please the narcissist. They feel guilty at feeling that they have let the narcissist down. And since the narcissists are always at the ready to tell you that you did let them down, it doubles down on your guilt. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse do not feel empowered or emboldened to speak out about how they feel or what they need or want particularly in that narcissistic relationship, but sometimes in many of their relationships. Maybe they get their little tiny, teeny passive victories, being a few minutes late and ruining this adult person's birthday party, or so they tell you, or they feel guilty about doing things that are actually very healthy, like setting an appropriate boundary, leaving an event early because the enabling and the toxicity is just too unhealthy for you to witness. But many times, people who are going through narcissistic abuse will ruminate about how much they absolutely dislike and detest a toxic family member or spouse or even their own adult child. It doesn't feel good to have those negative feelings in you. So you feel guilt about even thinking the thoughts, your thoughts. You're guilty about your thoughts. You're not doing anything. You're just thinking. These are catch-22 relationships. You can't win if you communicate, and not only having to put up, if you do communicate, you'd have to put up with a verbal lashing, but then with feeling guilty because maybe you hurt the narcissist's feelings, which, because of the narcissist's tendency to feeling victimized when they get called out, is made worse. They'll often sit and say, how come everyone's out to get me? And you kind of ugly cry when that happens. You can't win if you set boundaries, because you're going to feel guilty for setting that limit, though it's the only healthy thing to do. You can't win if you stay silent. You feel guilty for creating tension in the relationship. You can't win if you think a bad thought about them. You feel guilty for being a rotten person who thinks bad thoughts. Everywhere you turn, it's guilt, guilt, guilt. That's how trauma-bonded relationships work. You become your own worst judge, jury, and enemy. Guilt is the glue of the narcissistic relationship, and it can keep people stuck in these relationships for lifetimes. The other culprit is society. Society really has a lot to answer for. It tells you that you are wrong for not enabling the narcissist, for not giving second chances, for not giving the benefit of the doubt, for not forgiving, despite how many transgressions have happened. Society tells you that you have to be loyal to a family, even when they're unkind, cruel, or abusive, or that you shouldn't get divorced because it's shameful, despite the conditions. So that enabling of these toxic patterns from the world at large are a major driver of guilt, which is a core part of the experience of people going through narcissistic abuse. Guilt is also a part of what keeps the justification and cognitive dissonance alive. You feel guilty. You take responsibility. You feel you are to blame. And then you feel responsible for the problems in the relationship and feel you have no right to leave it or set a boundary in it because you're the guilty party. You feel guilty. You're always doing bad things, right? So what are you supposed to do about all this guilt as a massive pattern in narcissistic abuse? Listen, there's people out there that like to say guilt is a wasted emotion. I mean, I think it has its place. If you did do something wrong, make amends, learn from it, don't do it again. If this is, though, more about the guilt associated with trauma bonds, dissonance, and enabling, then the guilt is part of the toxic glue that binds this relationship. And wonder how you can ask for contrition. Why are you asking for contrition when you're the one who did nothing wrong? It's like going to confession and making stuff up to say because you didn't do anything wrong except maybe think a thought. You do the deeper dive on the societal messages you got growing up or even as an adult, and you need to critically analyze them. Then you need to recognize that your thoughts are a private, uncensored space where you can play things out, and it's okay. Having the thoughts and allowing them to play out is actually a really big step to breaking down cognitive dissonance. Instead of just trying to stop the thoughts, because they can sometimes be unsettling, and then jumping into the mire of guilt and justification, let those thoughts breathe. Your thoughts are yours, and nobody can judge them. As always, therapy. Therapy becomes really important around guilt. Guilt that emanates from a place of feeling that you have let people down, or just simply thought a bad thought, or just simply you feel guilty for being a human being. In therapy, we can take that in and dismantle it. Half the work I do in therapy is to say, you didn't do anything wrong. Guilt is a monster that not only gets people into narcissistic relationships, it keeps them in, and it makes it hard to get out or set boundaries. And that experience of guilt is a very classical part of narcissistic abuse. I did do a video on helplessness. Remember we were talking about Dr. Seligman's dogs who couldn't escape their little electric shocks? And as I developed this series, I struggled with whether powerlessness was just the same. But it isn't. There is a difference. Just to remind you, helplessness is the sense that nothing you can actually do or say can change a situation. You are resigned to be stuck and passive because you can't change it. Powerlessness is obviously similar, but there is also a cognitive or thinking realization piece of when we think about powerlessness. The recognition that you hold no real power within a given relationship or a family or an institution or a group of friends or a place of employment. And that lack of power may be due to how you are viewed within a system or existing assumptions around age, gender, race, or credentials that would render a person seemingly powerless. A silly example of this would be if an intern who was still in school had a great, brilliant idea for the company, but the others in the company viewed her as just some sort of inexperienced helper and have made that known to her. So she sticks to fetching coffee and organizing files. She perceives absolutely no power in that situation, which then for her translates into a helplessness because she feels she cannot enact change, and she has a great idea, but it's her lack of power combined with their unwillingness to hear her. It's similar in a family when you grow up with one or two narcissistic parents. A child obviously often has less power in a family, though in a few cases of golden children, there may be some exceptions, but when there are narcissistic parents, the child definitely has little power and perhaps could get more power if they just ally with or serve the narcissistic parents. But that doesn't always work. The child may not only perceive their own lack of power, but also perhaps that of the healthier, kinder parent. That can take a toll on the mental health of that child who can carry that sense of powerlessness into adulthood. In a relationship, powerlessness comes through many pathways. Sometimes people feel as though they lack power in a relationship because they don't make as much money, and so they aren't permitted or they don't feel empowered to weigh in on financial matters, or may not have the same level of education or job, so they may be minimized by a partner. Even outside the narcissistic realm, talking about intimate relationships in terms of power isn't actually that healthy. The gold standard of a healthy relationship is equality, balance of roles, and respect for each other. In essence, sort of the opposite of an intimate narcissistic relationship. So this idea of power, especially in a relationship, is very perceptual, and it often resides alongside the variable of control. Not that unhealthy idea of control where the narcissist controls everyone psychologically and requires the world to run on their schedule. I don't mean that. I mean the sense of control that someone feels so they feel safe. They feel like they can be agents in their own life. In the absence of feeling any power in a situation, people also feel a lack of control, which is magnified by being in a narcissistic relationship. And when we don't feel a sense of control, we can become very, very anxious. So what is it about narcissistic abuse that fosters this pattern of powerlessness and makes powerlessness a very common theme in narcissistically abusive relationships? First, Narcissists do want all of the power. It destabilizes them too much to share it, and they often don't have enough empathy or value other people enough to want to share the power, so they want it all for themselves, which renders other people in their presence feeling as though they are powerless or lacking any sense of control in a situation. Narcissists exert their power in many ways: intimidation, coercive control, manipulation, money, access to information, insults, isolation, and obviously, the more of that they do, the less power you feel. Secondly, because the narcissist often runs the narrative in the relationship and keeps it in place through behaviors such as gaslighting, you may also feel powerless. It's their story, and you are just stuck in it. Powerlessness sucks, and forgive me for being so inarticulate, but it does, because it harms you in many ways outside of the narcissistic relationship. It's an element of narcissistic abuse that really infects and affects other areas of your life. You may feel powerless at school, powerless with your own children, with your own health, at work, in other relationships. It tends to generalize beyond the narcissistic abuser, and that holds you back. In addition, a sense of powerlessness can also foster other patterns also observed in narcissistic abuse, such as helplessness and hopelessness and anxiety. When we lose our power, we lose our voice. We no longer feel we can advocate for ourselves or fight for what is important. And this is where the powerlessness part of narcissistic abuse gets tricky. When people are dealing with law, for example, law and justice, and this is most pronounced in divorce situations. By the time a person experiencing narcissistic abuse gets to the point of pursuing a divorce, they are shredded, confused, often quite scared, and always anxious. And I can promise you this, they feel powerless. And then they encounter a system that in fact lacks empathy and fosters that powerlessness. The law is the law, and sadly, the law doesn't care if your partner is a narcissist. They just want to divide everything up as evenly as possible, kids included, and call it a day. In many cases, even if you are working with a divorce attorney who says they're skilled in narcissism, you're still likely to feel powerless against this system. There's nothing you can say or do to lay out a strong argument for your kids or for your finances or for your future. So you can feel passively thrown about by a system that the narcissist is much better able to play than you are. And that's the bottom line. Narcissists are better at power plays than you or me because power matters to them. For the rest of us, it's less about power than maybe it is about respect, equity, communication, and fairness. But because narcissistic personalities are so obsessed with power, it can create this difficult space for the other person who is experiencing powerlessness. And sadly, since too often narcissists become leaders, they could be local leaders, municipal leaders, politicians, CEOs, bosses of all kinds, they create the systems. And they create systems that foster powerlessness in the rest of us. It's an example of how the greater narcissism in the world creates an experience of narcissistic abuse for everybody. And yep, culture plays a role too. In certain cultures, certain groups are stripped of power by function of gender, race, and social class. That powerlessness is very real and kept in place by narcissistic governmental and other institutional structures. And that sense of powerlessness in the culture fosters a greater likelihood of narcissism in the culture and subsequent powerlessness in your own relationships. So, what do you do in the face of powerlessness that's engendered by narcissistic abuse? First, remember that the power grab of a narcissist is a byproduct of their insecurity. In that way, you find stealth ways to get the power. One area I see many people lose their power in is in close relationships, is the loss of financial power. The narcissist will often run the finances in a relationship so they can control them and hold a lot of power, to the degree that you can't even get passwords or see tax returns or know where all the bank accounts are. You want to try to get that information and start getting your power back. Second, pay attention to the stories that you tell yourself. Yes, narcissistic abuse is about powerlessness, but it's also about you believing that this idea that there's nothing I can do. You may not entirely be able to address the situation, but there may be small things you can do that can at least help you get back some of your power. Third, find the little places in your life where you can have power, the choices you can make. Whether these are friendships, work, volunteering, any place you can exert that, just a little of it, can at least fortify you and remind you that you are not entirely in the powerless position that narcissistic abuse can foster. Fourth, you know what I'm going to say. I wish there was an audience. You could say it out loud. Therapy. It's the usual drill. It's a place to muse over what has happened to your power and to think about what it means to be powerless. Fifth, try and be the change that the world needs. It's time to upend social structures that leave people feeling powerless. You can do this through voting, volunteering, being an informed citizen by actually reading all points of views, heck, even run for office yourself. Whatever each of us can do to return to a world or fantasy, where power is somewhat equitably distributed is important. And sixth, believe it or not, in a narcissistic relationship, you're the one who actually has the power. In most cases, you would probably be better off without this relationship. But the narcissist is often the insecure one who's afraid you're going to leave them, even though they try to keep you in the relationship by bullying and manipulation. You actually always have the winning card in your hand. Always remind yourself, they need you more than you need them. Maybe power is relative, but I think many of us would argue power is quite real. And as a part of narcissistic abuse, a sense of powerlessness is a pretty classical piece of the picture. I hope that you can go back and get some of that sense of your power in the world back. As always, thank you for tuning in. I hope this has given you some clarity. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe. If you like this video, give us that thumbs up. Hit that notification bell, and you will get a daily reminder, or more or less often, whenever we put out new content. Thanks again. Bye.